Most of the films you make have been animated films. That's to say, you've been in the cutting room alone with just the celluloid and your brushes or paints or your razor blade or whatnot, and working just on celluloid with shapes and animal shapes and so on. But usually you don't work with human beings. But on one occasion you made a film called Neighbours with Garth Monroe here, where you did use actors, but you applied the technique of animation that you've been using normally to actors, to living people. This is something unusual for you, and I suppose it was a little more difficult.
Well, it certainly was more difficult than doing animation by any other way. But on the other hand, it was essentially the same in principle. In other words, it meant using a camera that takes a single picture, a single frame at a time, and between each frame being taken, you move the object in front of the camera, or move whatever it is. If it's a person, you move the person.
Just like ordinary.
Yes. Now, for instance, take these chairs over there. Now, if you had an animation camera, you could make them, if we wanted to sit on them, you could make them come to us. Or, on the other hand, we can do it the other way around. The film Neighbours uses this type of animation quite a lot, the animation people. And this is how the film starts off, with two neighbors sitting amicably beside each other.
The flower is initially very popular, and McLaren's Neighbours fly with joy, a technique of animating people rarely used on such a scale.
When we shot the flying sequence in Neighbours, there was bright sunlight, and the shadow of the figure on the ground gave a feeling of height, and I think that was important to that.
I will click a frame at the height of your jump, right?
Yes. And in this sequence, we had to shoot the whole sequence at once, because any pause in it would have varied the height of the figure. All right.
Click. Click.
McLaren's clicks mark the click of a movie camera taking a single picture, later to be projected, of course, at 24 pictures or frames a second.
And you had to do, how much of that did you have to do then, at once?
I think we did about 300, something like that, because the other neighbor told us after the sequence that he had a heart murmur, and we had to stop shooting for about a week.
And so the effect of that is that you expose a single frame at the height of the jump.
Yes.
And therefore, when you run all the frames together, ground appears to be flying through the air in that position.
With the greatest of ease. Now, the very heart and essence of animation is varying the sizes of the moves. It's the secret. A good animator feels when to vary the size. It's in his blood. Now, if I were to animate it this way, click, 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 click.
Well, what's all that?
Well, I'm trying to get a little action in the jaw, a little single frame handling.
That would be a very lifeless looking thing on the screen.
Because it's even.
It's
regular.
even. It's like that. Or even if that's fast, it's even. The essential characteristic of a punch is that it accelerates very steeply, like this. Click, 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 click.
I see. So the moves get bigger toward the end.
And if we saw that animated and on screen, would really look very convincing. with a lot of force behind it.
Yes. What I'd like to know is how do you work out what sort of movements the body does in situations like that? Did you study photographs of boxes being hit or people being smashed with fences or people skating? I mean, you just
No, I
worked out your own...
just felt it. Just had to know the number of seconds between one point and the next, and just improvise.
But you're an animator yourself.
Yes.
Now, when you say you had to work out the time,
Yes.
do you have to think in terms of frames and how long a frame lasts?
We convert frames into seconds right away in our minds. We understand that this action will be 10 frames long, while this action is about 25 frames long.
Neighbours was an experiment also in its use of a soundtrack, hand-drawn on cards by McLaren himself and then photographed. But most of all, it was an innovation in its theme, a kind of violent pacifism.
I can attribute the fact that I made Neighbors, the fact that I'd spent a year in China just before that.
McLaren was involved in a project called Health in the Village in China in the years 1949 and 1950.
What were you doing there?
I went out, UNESCO sent me out there to teach audio-visual aids, but very cheap and simple visual aids, to a group of Chinese artists. And I taught poster making and silkscreen and film strip making. I taught the Chinese artists to draw these strips on 35mm film directly with a pen and ink, and we colored them and then made prints, colored prints from that, and projected them in the village to the villagers on topics like tuberculosis, how to prevent it, hookworm, how to prevent it getting into the soles of your feet, and how to rear silkworms, how to preserve oranges.
Did you see the effect of what you were doing on the villagers?
Yes, I went out to screenings in the evenings where people would, maybe 200 or 300 people would sit around the screen. Then afterwards, the screening would have the effect in the number of people that came the following week or so to the clinic for our attention. If we had the film strip on, say, trachoma of the eyes, we'd have people coming the following week.
It must have been very satisfying.
Yes, it was.
Did you find that there was an influence on you reciprocally from the Chinese artists?
Well, it was the first time I'd ever done a teaching job, and I learned quite a lot about it, about the job of teaching. That was the most important thing I learned, is that you don't teach by telling people to do this or that, but you try to bring it out of them, what's in them, and let them think it out for themselves.
So to get back to the theme of Neighbours, when you came back after this year's work for UNESCO, you obviously felt in some ways a changed man. You'd learned a lot, you'd been taught how to teach, you'd learned something from the artists, but you'd also felt that you were involved much more in human problems.
Yes. I'd always been interested in human problems, particularly as a teenager, in my late teens and early 20s. And as an amateur, I made an anti-war film. Then I sort of drifted off into abstract films and got more and more detached from human problems. But just the experience of China, and 2 months after I went to China, the communists took over, and I saw what was happening in our village because of them, and a lot of good things happened. And so I became fairly sympathetic to the new regime. And when I came back to Canada, it was just at the beginning of the Korean War. And I felt myself estranged to some extent, or being pulled between one culture and another, and one side and another side. And the tension that built up in me because of this produced neighbors.